Yeah, can everybody hear me okay? Jillian, maybe I'll just do a check with you. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Mhm.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Jason Lum. I'm the chair of the Fraser Valley Regional District and a councillor here in the city of Chilliwack. So welcome to the Mid and Upriver Dialogue here, presented by the LFFC. I know as we get Tyrone's mic fixed up, he would want to welcome everyone as well. This is a really important opportunity for everybody to get together and find out a bit of an update on this initiative and the good work that's transpired over the last little while, because I know there's been a lot of work that's been going on in the background. It's a great opportunity for us to learn about what each other is doing and open up opportunities to collaborate. I do have to apologize a little bit. I actually got home last night at midnight because I was away on holidays in Mexico, and it looks like we brought the sunshine, but I'm certainly I'm here to listen and to support everyone in the work that's happening today. I would ask that everybody come with open hearts and open minds and look for opportunities to share and collaborate and build relationships. That's certainly been one of the things that I've loved about participating in these dialogues, and I anticipate today will be the same opportunity. So thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to everyone who put on all of the hard work to get this done in the background. I know whether you're meeting by Zoom or meeting in person, there's still a ton of work that goes on by all the organizers. So and my hands go up to them. Thank you, Slade, for the opening welcome. I know we're not all gathered here in one specific place, but I'll just acknowledge that I'm here on the Chilkoot territory, the unceded territory of the Chilkoot people, and certainly thankful to be able to be here and do good work today. So thank you, and looking forward to the presentations.
Thank you very much, Jason. And sorry, in my flusterness, I forgot to introduce you. Jason is the chair of the Fraser Valley Regional District and a councillor for the city of Chilliwack. Just to be clear. Yeah, thank you very much, Jason. Okay, welcome from the Emergency Planning Secretariat. We're very happy to have this conversation, and it has been a long time coming. And I'll explain some of that past and how we got here a little bit later in my presentation. But Tyrone has been a real instigator in this work, and he's been absolutely instrumental in keeping us focused and moving us along and making progress in the right way towards resilience. So all of EPS's, a lot of the vision and the direction that EPS goes is from Tyrone, and he's moving us all forward in a very good direction. So I guess that's my welcome, my opening, and my thank you to Tyrone.
Okay, so welcome everyone, and apologies, we're navigating all sorts of technical difficulties this morning. So thank you for your patience, and really grateful to everyone for joining us here this morning. And I'll just give us an overview. Myself and Dan Stricker will be sort of helping this whole process along today. We're here from 9 o'clock to 12:30, and we'll be moving through a few different parts of the morning. So our intentions today are around, this is a sub-regional gathering. Some of you, I think there's a fair number of you who have attended one or both of the regional forums that have been held previously. You'll hear a bit more about that in a little bit. These are our first sub-regional forums. We just held one with the Coastal and River Tidal region yesterday, and that was really wonderful to gather together with everyone and have this conversation. And today we're gathering with the mid-river and upriver subregions. So we'll also introduce that and let you know sort of how we're approaching this as we go through the day. So one of the intentions here is to be able to gather with neighbors and learn more about what's happening in this area. And we're going to have a focus today also on critical infrastructure and essential services. From the previous forum that we held, this was a priority that was identified, and it's also been identified in other work related to flood. And so today we're going to focus on that conversation and coming together to better understand what sort of the high priorities might be and the places we could start to take action in that direction. And we also, this sub-regional approach is new, and we want to also hear from you right from the beginning what would help to shape this in ways that would be helpful and useful to you in doing this work and carrying that forward. So that's some of what we're here to do today. And as always, of course, continuing to build the relationships, the connections, the shared understanding that are the foundation for all of this work going forward. So as I mentioned, we're here till about 12:30 today. We'll start with we'll have a few presentations throughout the morning and also some good time for discussion. We'll be breaking into small groups to have some discussion at a couple of points. And the first one will be to share ideas that you have, things that you know of, or things that you're aspiring to or would like to see in relation to the kind of 5 principles-based work that the Lower Fraser Floodplains Coalition has been working to help support in the region, and we'll get more into what that is. And the other piece is around that critical infrastructure and essential services. So we'll have a couple of speakers at that point as well to frame up that issue and then have some conversation about that. So we'll be moving through various pieces this morning and really looking forward to hearing from you in particular through those discussion times. And to support those conversations, one of the intentions of this work is to bring together really a diversity of folks from across the subregions to be in dialogue together. And so we want to also ensure that we all come to this in a way that will help to create a space that will allow everyone to share what they have to say, and also in a way that allows us to listen and to really give that gift of listening and of hearing where others are coming from, which also is a gift to all of us to sort of, as we bring these perspectives together, to have a better understanding as a whole. So the first one is practice confidentiality. So anything that's said here today, please feel free to share what you've experienced, how this has affected you, or the insights that you've had. If it's something that someone else has shared, please ask their permission before sharing that, or simply hold that in confidence and don't share that any further. Also, just as a general guideline, really being mindful of bringing a respectful ear and respectful presence to this work. As Jason said, listening with an open heart and mind. And, in those moments where you might be encountering someone who has different perspectives to you, really taking that as an opportunity to get curious as opposed to getting opposed. So just an invitation to everyone to really lean into the curiosity today. And that's what the be for one another means here is really, be curious and recognize the human on the other side of this conversation and what might be motivating them. If you're someone who tends to speak a lot or it's easy for you to step into conversation, be aware of that, leave space for others. And likewise, if you're someone who tends to hang back, please do bring your voice here too. We do want to hear from everyone. Everyone's voices are important. And also bringing your full self to this. So to the extent that you can, closing other windows, being present for this bit of time that we have here today. I know it's easy to get distracted into other things. And if you need to tend to other things, please do take care of your needs throughout the morning. And do try to be as present as you can to this conversation. We'll be going into the small groups and asking you to turn your videos on if possible, and you're welcome to in the plenary as well. It's always great to see your faces and feel more part of the group here this morning. And at any moment, similarly, in terms of taking care of needs, feel free to take a breath. Feel free to, even in your groups, do that with everyone if that's what feels like what would be helpful. So do take care of yourself and each other throughout the morning. And so we're on Zoom here today, and it works a little bit different than being in person, of course. But in terms of supporting the groups and figuring out how to put you all together with a number of other people, we'd appreciate if you could help us out in this respect. And I'll just describe to you how to do this. We're going to ask if you could try and rename yourself. So I'm not sure what would be showing up on your screen right now, but if you can find your little square, like the one you're looking at right now, for me, your video square, and hover over that, there will be 3 dots on the upper right corner. If you click on that, there's an option to rename. And if you could do that and place either mid or up before your name, depending which list your community falls into here, that will just help us in knowing who to put where in the breakout groups. So if folks can do that, and if enough folks do that, that will help us a lot and we can figure out the rest. So if you can't figure out how to do this, don't worry about it. But if you can, that would be very helpful. Again, these are the subregions, and we'll talk a little bit, Jillian will tell you a little bit more about these in a moment. So for now, just enough to know that the mid-river are these ones listed on the left and the upriver is to the right. And we're just using that to group you with folks who you are neighbors with. So. All right, and one other note just before I carry on is in terms of I wanted to mention with the recording. So we are recording. If you have any concerns about that and not wanting to ensure that that there wouldn't be any mention of you or that you wouldn't be seen there, please let us know. Also, it will only record this plenary piece. The recording won't happen in the breakout room, so you can feel confident to turn on your video and talk freely in those breakout groups. The recording won't be happening in the breakout groups. It's only here in the plenary. Okay, and Juniper is just giving us a tip that you need to be in standard or gallery view to see your video. So that one I think shows up on the top right as well. And you can choose the view and then get to it there. I think you can also get to it through the participants list. Just find your name there and it will give you the option there. All right. And I'll pass this back to Jillian now, who is going to share. We're going to have a couple of people share here around the context to our discussion today and some of the updates and context to the regional conversation. So over to you, Jillian.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, again. My name is Jillian Fuss. I'm the manager for the Emergency Planning Secretariat. I was told to find a picture of myself doing some emergency things. So I found a picture of me and a rabbit who was urgently in need of love. That was my emergency that I decided to put up. I just wanted to check to see some of the faces as we're going through, just to make sure. I know what we'd asked you to do required some concentration. So I just wanted to see if people were done renaming themselves. It looks like we do have some successful people with an up or a mid in front of their name. So good job to those of you who figured it out. That's awesome. Or afterwards is also great too. If you don't want to do it above your name, that's fantastic. So thank you for those of you that indulged us in that exercise. So what I'm going to do a little bit is to just explain some of the a little bit of the context about why we're meeting today and how we got to this point. So as you can see on the right side of the screen, the Lower Fraser Floodplains Forum 2023 Dialogue on Regional Action. So last year in June, we held our last forum, and that was a large forum for the entire Lower Mainland. We had a really great turnout. We had quite a few farmers, First Nations, as well as municipalities, provincial folks. It was a really good conversation, and we definitely heard that there's an appetite for this type of work. What we also heard is that there's an interesting, the presentation from Floodplains by Design down in Washington really impacted people, that this is something that's possible. But the question is, how do we make it possible in our region? How do we turn that from a cool idea into something on the ground. And so one of the ways that we wanted to do that was to sit down in smaller groups and identify how the landscape needs to change together. What are the opportunities that we can identify together as neighbors, and identify how, and to do that well, we first need to identify what's important. So what really cannot get wet. And so once those priorities, and so those priorities are what Erica was identifying as critical infrastructure. So what are the things that you need to continue life and livelihood during an emergency? And so that would be we also call this local essential services in local governments. So critical infrastructure can be more regional. Local essential services are more local, but they're both essential for life and livelihood. So turn your mind to that as we're thinking about this as we're going forward, is that's going to be the focus of the conversation. We'll have a little bit of introduction into what critical infrastructure or local essential services can be, how they're impacted during an emergency, and then that'll be the basis for the conversation is how do we, what are the things that really need to be sort of solidified and can't get wet during an emergency. Okay, and I am in charge. Oh, there we go. Okay, I am working, or my slides are working. So as we've mentioned, the regions are broken up based on the EPS hubs model. So part of what we're doing in Helix Kaka, and I'll explain what that is in a second, is we're supporting mainland Coast Salish communities to build capacity. So build internal capacity within community, but also to build collaborative capacity throughout the region. And to do that, we have coordinated with our region to have 4 separate hubs. That's upriver, midriver, river tidal, and coastal. We also call river tidal double whammy because it's hit by both the river and the tidal influence or the storm surge, as well as sea level rise. Although with climate change, those folks of you in the mid-river may actually be influenced by sea level rise and by some of those tidal influences in the future. So just to keep that in mind. But yesterday we had the meeting with the folks on the bottom of the circle, and today we're having a meeting with the folks on the top of the circle. And so local governments, if you want to know which one you're in, just find your First Nation neighbor, and that'll tell you where you are. Okay, so how did we get from where we are, where we were to where we are now? This is a bit of a context just to show the change in the flood landscape and the flood planning landscape since about 2007. So in 2007, we saw UNDRIP, then we saw the Lower Mainland Flood Management Strategy start in 2014. This strategy actually was the impetus to EPS beginning. So Emergency Planning Secretariat started out as a support agency for mainland Coast Salish communities adapting to understanding risk and adapting to risk. Because the Lower Mainland Flood Management Strategy did not include First Nations in the very beginning parts of its development, and by the time communities were involved had moved too far to be able to pivot to include community viewpoints, we were created to ensure or to try and ensure that doesn't happen again, and to support communities with finding these opportunities and participating in these conversations, and also advocating for communities to make sure that they're not left out. So that's in between, I guess, the beginning of the Lower Mainland Flood Management Strategy and going forward, you can see between LMFMS and DRIPA here, there was also a big change of government. So a big change in terms of how we were thinking and addressing things, particularly in terms of how understanding the government's responsibility and therefore consultants who are working for the government, their responsibility to First Nations. So that really came apparent there. One of the other concerns about the Lower Mainland Flood Management Strategy was that it didn't solve its impetus question, which was that we understood that to upgrade all of the dikes to where they need to be, knowing that most of them are not up to current seismic standards. They were built with old cars or whatever the heck was lying around in the 1948 flood, and then shoved some dirt on top of there. They're not in good condition, but to update them all to where predictions are predicting we would need to be with climate change for freshet and for sea level rise would be extremely cost prohibitive. So we need a bit of a different solution. We can't just rely on dikes. And so that was never really solved through the Lower Mainland Flood Management Strategy, is what other things can be used. And so we're not saying that all the dikes need to go, but saying that dikes cannot be the only strategy because we just don't have enough funding to be able to do that. So we need a couple of other things mixed in there as well. So that strategy continued for a little while until I believe the First Nations EPS First Nation leadership officially left, and then the Lower Mainland Flood Management Strategy went into the Pathways to Action report. Along the way, we also saw the atmospheric river, which was really a landmark change to how we understood risk, given that we had an atmospheric river before in 1990, where we had a similar experience of the Sumas Lake coming back. But even still, in the atmospheric river, we had quite a few people saying that they didn't know what an atmospheric river was. They also didn't know, many of the people who were living at the bottom of the lake didn't realize that there was a lake there. So it just shows that difference or dissonance between people's risk and their perceived risk, or how they understand or that they are at risk, and how different our communication is around what that risk looks like. So just identifying that that was a really big turning point in terms of recognizing that we are not just at risk of freshet here, but we're also at risk of atmospheric rivers. And then also the next year, California received up to, I think it was 3 times as much rainfall as we did here. And that could be something that we would face in our future. So acknowledging that this was one incident, but it could get worse with climate change. And so it just really sort of laser focused us to realize that we have quite a bit of work to do. Right after that was when the LFFC really came together, trying to understand how the Sendai framework and DRIPA could be applied to this incident. So Sendai framework focuses on one of the principles of the Sendai framework is build back better. So take an emergency as an opportunity, since things have broken, to take a look at what's working and what's not working, and how can we build it better so that the same incident, when it happens again in 30 years, happened 30 years ago, happens again in 30 years, we're not suffering those same impacts next time. And then we added to that, build back better together, to make sure that communities were working together. So build back better together just means no municipality, flooding doesn't recognize boundaries. No municipality can do this alone. They need to work with their neighbors. They need to work with neighboring First Nations as well as municipalities, and work together to build a resilient collaborative landscape that goes across borders and fulfills the articles of DRIPA. So LFFC really got started there. We were originally called Build Back Better Together because of that, and then we've switched into LFFC, and I'll explain why in a second. And through that came the 5 principles. After that point, we started having the initial forums there talking about those principles way back when, in 2021, 2022. And since then, we've seen some really amazing shifts that really are carrying some of those same principles from other places. So we see the National Adaptation Strategy. We've had a whole new ministry being created. We've also seen the Pathways to Action was released. The BC Flood Strategy is not quite released yet, but we do have an update today, as well as EDMA and a few other things. So we're getting signaling from both directions, from the federal and the provincial government, that climate change is something that we really need to be focusing on with respect to risk. We need to be understanding the threats from climate change to communities, but we also need to be looking at how can we improve our planning to become resilient to those impacts. So it's a really cool signal from all different sides that this is something we really need to be focusing on, and this is the direction that we need to be going. Luckily, we're in this region, through these meetings, we're already doing it. We're on the right track, and we have a little bit of a head start. The question just is, how do we want to do it, which is part of the conversation today. All right, so the Emergency Planning Secretariat, as I said, we got started in about, I was the first employee. I was hired in 2019. And again, we got started as a result of the lack of engagement from the Lower Mainland Flood Management Strategy. Since then, we've branched out. So we support 31 mainland Coast Salish First Nations with everything from emergency planning to understanding legislation to collaborative and coordinated capacity building. And so we originally started more on the flooding risk planning side, but we have shifted a little bit more into emergency response after the atmospheric river, since we were doing a fair amount of emergency response. So now we go anywhere from let's look at the legislation and open it up and advocate for things that communities would like to see, all the way to you need sand during an emergency, I'll find you sand. Anywhere in there is where we work. oops, sorry. We are governed, or not governed, we are led by our strategy called Helix Gaka, which is Halka for to get ready together. And it's a framework that supports mainland Coast Salish communities developing protocols for climate adaptation and disaster resilience based on community values to build out internal capacity. So how can we weave together? Communities didn't have a lot of these same impacts. There is a large, we heard yesterday, Joanne Charles was talking about the flood story of communities that tied their canoes to the top of Sumas Mountain. That was a significant flood. Most of the floods that impact us nowadays would not have impacted communities in the same way because communities would move to higher ground. So a lot of these impacts that we're facing are only impacts because of the way that settlers have chosen to build on the landscape. And so we want to pull some of that knowledge and inherent resilience that communities have and weave that together with Western science and other best practices from around the world to find something that's truly resilient and rooted in the community culture of this area. We also are looking to support communities in assessing and addressing risks for climate change, as well as supporting, again, collaboration and coordination. This is what Helix Gaka looks like. We have 6 priorities for action. So the first 4 are very much Sendai, and then we have 2 base pillars. So strengthening tactical capacity, and then Hyatmathat, which is humanitarian aid and wellness for not just for community members who have evacuated or been impacted by emergencies, but also for emergency responders because they tend to carry that stress with them for quite a while, and it's important to find a place to deal with that. And when we used to have a hazard season where now it seems like we have emergencies all year round. And so finding the time to be able to offload some of that is quite challenging. Oops, did I go too far again? I cannot figure this out, Dan. I'm so sorry. Some of our guiding principles for Helix Gaka, resilience over protection, and reducing the need for response with effective planning. So if we can plan in an effective way, we can eventually reduce the need for us to respond to those emergencies and reduce the threat and the stress that comes with those emergencies. So what we mean by that is, if taking an atmospheric river, for example, if we have adequate drainage in the majority of communities, the water can fall. And it doesn't necessarily pool because we have areas for drainage. For example, we can have rain gardens, we can have adequate stormwater areas. We have our rivers and sloughs that are cleaned out and healthy, so they can provide that extra water storage space for that extra water. And then we don't need to have that additional emergency response. Obviously, we're not going to be able to outplan everything. An earthquake in particular is a very hard one to outplan. But we definitely can do our best, especially when it comes to freshet and other types of flooding. But it's all about thinking about planning as the main focus, rather than and trying to sort of tap into that part of the majority of the risk that we're facing is because of the way that we've decided to organize ourselves on the landscape. And so how can we better reorganize ourselves so that we're not quite at risk or as at risk? And that's that resilience over protection piece. We also are looking into building community preparedness through training and exercising, leveraging nature-based solutions, enhancing biodiversity and protecting non-human relatives, collaboration, enhancing food security. I have collaboration on there twice. That's how important that is. Protection of cultural, spiritual, and archaeological sites. Hyatmathat, which I mentioned, and as well looking to advocate for cultural competency for all groups who are working with First Nation communities. So having a level of understanding of First Nations culture, needs, and how to effectively build relationships. And then see First Nations exercising jurisdiction over their traditional and tidal lands as per Article 29 of DRIPA. Oop, I went too far again. This is the Lower Fraser Floodplains Coalition. Again, we were initially Build Back Better Together, but we've really shifted our focus to something much more long-term, rather than just on the recovery of the atmospheric river, into something more long-term, where we can look to the future and plan for the next atmospheric river or the next flood event, whenever that comes, and beyond. So we're a whole different group of different folks coming from different backgrounds. We've got some engineers, we've got leadership, we've got I think, sorry, Tamsin is also an engineer. We also have professors, and we have a lawyer. So it's a very exciting, different multidisciplinary group, but all looking to that same goal of seeing flood resiliency in the Lower Mainland. Some of our priorities are, we focus on supporting conversation, supporting projects, and education around resilience best practices. So we're very happy to put on, if you need more or additional support in terms of getting a project off the ground that matches the 5 principles, or in terms of understanding more about how the 5 principles could be applied, we're the team. You can reach out to us at any time to learn more about that. Okay, these are the 5 principles that support us in all of our work. So these were initially presented at, I believe it was 2 forums ago. In the last forum, they were very much agreed to. They've also been agreed to by Minister Ma, Minister Ralston, and Minister Heyman. So it sounds like the provincial government is really aligning themselves with these principles and agreeing that these principles are in line with where we need to go in the future, which is really exciting. So the principles are reducing risk and adapting to climate change. So what I was talking about before is understanding where that risk comes from and reducing that at its core. So why are we, for example, if we have houses that are built right next to the water, those houses are at high risk. So how do we reduce that risk for those houses? So that could be moving them back. It could be moving them to a less risky area, things like that. So all of those should be part of the conversation. And that's adapting to climate change. So part of what we have been looking at over the last couple of years is how water scarcity is going to impact us going forward. Before atmospheric river was before freshet was one of our largest threats. Now is freshet going to be less, and it's going to be more atmospheric river? Those are the kind of models that we need to be looking at now and need to be understanding. Advancing reconciliation, so ensuring that First Nations are part of First Nations have legal rights to be involved in any decisions that affect their territories, and knowledge of how the floodplains work that deserves respect. So that means working with First Nation communities at the very beginning, so collaborating, harmonizing plans, and bringing First Nations in to talk about at the very beginning of your planning stages for your projects, and making harmonized plans for how we can work together to improve the resilience of our landscapes. Ensuring that salmon are thriving. We're using salmon as a model organism, but this really means ensuring that not just salmon are thriving, but that all ecosystems are thriving. And then the sort of end goal of that is that salmon will be good too. Supporting sustainable economies and resilient communities. So having both of those things on the table at the same time, and trying to find that balance between making sure that we do have a sustainable economy, but we also have a community that can withstand emergencies, and making everyone part of the solution. So we want to hear from everyone as part of this. We've had farmers come to our meetings in the past. I don't know if we have any here today. We also need to reach out to other folks in the floodplain. Sendai says that you need to work with the most vulnerable communities should be the ones driving your risk reduction. And that's because those are the communities that will be the most impacted by any emergency. And so we want to make sure that we're following that principle to its core. So these serve as our touchstones. And the next move is more to action and applying how these will work in the real world, which again is part of the conversation today. So I know that some may have had some doubts and concerns. I know that in the past we, especially me, I talk about resilience over protection, and I think that sometimes causes some concern about, well, the dikes, some of the dikes are there for a reason, and that's true. That's why it's true. We don't want to remove them all, but we want to have that conversation about which ones need to be there, and how do we go about this in a way that brings everyone together and that we can all agree to. So if you have doubts, if you have concerns, if you have questions, today is the time to bring those up, because we want this to be, Erica's working very hard to make sure that this is a safe space for everyone to bring those concerns, and for your input to be heard, and for us to find a way forward together. Okay, and over to Laura Plant, Executive Director of Flood Resilience at the Ministry of Walrus.
And Julian, before we do that, I wanted to check in and see if Tyrone was able to unmute, because this might be a moment for him to jump in. Oh, but I'm seeing maybe he's dropped off.
Can you hear me okay?
Welcome, Tyrone. Yeah, we can hear you.
Hi. Technical issues here. This one, Erica, if I could take a couple minutes to kind of set the table, maybe a little bit differently than Julian did. Did a good job from your perspective, Julian, but bring it in from my perspective around one of the reasons we're having this conversation with everybody is around Creating awareness. You hear me preaching, we need to look at risk differently. And government officials are starting to get it a little bit, certainly with Walrus. I'm really happy how Walrus recognizes that the climate is changing. We're trying to respond to it. You'll hear from Laura through the flood strategy in a minute. But they're really concerned about EMCR because they haven't drank that tea. They're really troubled with the regulations and the secrecy around regulations. So from my context, Erica and Gillian, one of the central purposes of having a session like this is to bring everybody up to speed on where risk may be going with regard to climate, severe events, the regularity of severe events. We're not going to have a 1 in 100-year flood in every 100 years now. It could be 50 years, 20 years, or whatever, right? So we need to look at that differently and hopefully educate and win over people that resilience and nature-based options. I used to say nature-based solutions, but there isn't enough. There's considerable options there to be done in such a way that is strategic throughout what we call Self-Tmuch, our traditional territory, and in collaboration with others like local governments, farmers, British Columbians, whoever is living in our backyard, in a way that we have a deeper understanding of risk, and we're educating ourselves on how can we be more resilient to that risk, leaving completely aside for now the provinces, or at least the bureaucratic aspect of the province and the federal government. Let's jump to mitigation. And I argue you can't jump to mitigation without having a really deep understanding of risk and the changing risk in a time of. And whether you want to call it climate change or not, there are some disbelievers out there yet, but responding to the severity and regularity of severe events here in Southwest British Columbia, and done in such a way that our rights are brought to bear. Gillian raised Article 29, which speaks to our right to protect your land and resources, absolutely, but it's an opportunity to educate and maybe de-risk local government's fear on what that might mean. Because in 2014, 10 years ago, the highest court in the country ruled that we as First Nations have title to our traditional lands. But we haven't allowed that to hit the ground yet. And I think the province might have jumped a little bit too far forward when they started talking about amending the Lands Act. And certainly we're going there, but some fear mongering is preventing us from doing that right now. So, but we will get there. And appreciating that you as local government officials, you have delegated authority from British Columbia, you call it the provincial crown. Our rights predate the development of the crown, whether you call that the inherent right policy, whether you call it our ability to manage and govern what is important to us. And the de-risk or taking the fear away from that is that I know a lot of you local governments, you're like-minded when you want to promote biodiversity, when you want to promote green solutions over pavement and rock solutions, that you support and prioritize nature and natural options wherever we can. And I appreciate that. And I really feel your pressure when we're talking about risk in high risk areas, affecting your ability to develop, affecting your ability to build your tax base. And we need to come to grips with that, because you can't continue building and developing in high risk flood areas. So here's an opportunity for us to explore that. What does that mean to you? What does that mean to us? It's really important from our worldview that we allow the river to grow. We know there's 1,500 kilometers of historic fish-bearing streams blocked from the Fraser by dikes, railways, and roads. Well, let's open those up. As you're going to hear over and over, one of the most important things to us is salmon. And what DFO calls the long run salmon, going all the way up past Prince George, DFO has basically given up on them. So here's an opportunity to reconstitute this historic runs here in the Lower Mainland Fraser Valley that were there pre-development. And let's get on the same page there. And it's an opportunity to look at things in a way that we're looking well out in the future, 2100 and beyond. Because local governments, I'm really hoping you're paying attention to insurers when they're walking away from Oregon and California on forest fires. Insurers are walking away from other parts of Canada on floods. So that's a real fear there. the BC and Canada can only bail you out so often and to so much. So that they have to be, their views should be considered here too, because, you know, we if something happens, we want insurance to cover us, or at least ability to respond effectively. And finally, for now, this conversation we're having is coming to grips with what we perceive and are building a response to Chilcotin around the expression of title. And it's our rights are collective; they're not individual. So it's an opportunity to get away for us to get away from Indian Act to reconstitute our tribal relations, our sense of nationhood throughout mainland Coast Salish country, but with the intent of doing things that we're responsible for. It's hard to explain in English, but it's the impetus behind us wanting to protect salmon, rebuild salmon habitat, all those kind of things, is some of the foundational rights of who we are as Stalo people, as Hólmok, as Coast Salish. But to do that in a non-threatening way, we certainly appreciate we don't have the capacity to occupy that tidal space for all of our territory. Many of you have authority and levels of jurisdiction coming from the province, and we need to come to grips with that. And we don't need to do it at the provincial level. We've got 31 mainland Coast Salish communities, 29 local governments. I think these kinds of conversations will help describe and find a pathway through that, knowing that we don't have to put all of that on the table. Right now, we're talking about flood, we're talking about resilience, we're talking about nature-based options. We're talking about coming to grips and to be more prepared for the next event, knowing that there's going to be a next event sooner than later. And really looking forward to working with all of our communities and local governments and our local MPs and MLAs to push both orders of government to start investing more meaningfully in preparedness. Because it's a big piece of Sendai is understanding the risk and de-risking things that are coming in the near future and a bit farther in the future. I'll leave it there for now, Erica. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tyrone, and glad you could join to add that perspective here today. And thank you so much for your leadership in this work. So we'll move now to Laura Plant from the Ministry of Water, Lands and Resource Stewardship. Welcome, Laura.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. I'm joining you from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Esquimalt and Songhees nations here in Victoria. And I'll ask you to skip to the next slide, please. Thanks, Dan. I'll be speaking on the flood strategy, and I would welcome Tribal Chief Tyrone McNeil to join me on any slides he'd feel comfortable speaking to, because we often have the opportunity to speak to this work together. He's been very integral in our development of it from the get-go and advising us on how to work with rights and title holders in a good way to build this work together. So Tyrone, that's an open invitation on this one. The province has definitely heard First Nations, local governments, and the public call upon us to enhance the strategic direction and investment in flood risk reduction. As has been noted by previous speakers, the sort of severity and regularity of flooding events now with climate change has put a real demand on communities in terms of maintaining and upgrading their flood resilience options and strategies. And we also said about this work wanting to incorporate the articles of UNDRIP and to sort of shift the paradigm of how we manage floods, particularly recognizing that a lot of First Nations communities are more directly impacted by flooding based on the location along the rivers. We've had the opportunity to connect with many in the development of this strategy over the last 3 years. And I'll go into more details, but as a high-level strategy, we've still got implementation planning to do. And so forums like this really help us to build on that spirit of collaboration and make plans to take that provincial lens that I'll be sharing with you and translate it into regional and sub-regional action. So I'll just thank the LFFC conveners for putting this together today, and I hope we continue this good trend of collaboration. Next slide, please. So the draft BC Flood Strategy has the vision you see here of a holistic flood management that really takes an all of society approach for us working together over the long term. And the principles that you see there were developed jointly, not just for that provincial perspective on how we would approach flooding, but we hope will also be incorporated into regional and local processes. And I won't go into detail because of the, to be brief today, but these pieces are available on our Engage BC website through the intentions paper. Next slide, please. So the work was really informed by the UN Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. As Tyrone spoke to needing that deeper understanding of risk and how we can be resilient to risk, particularly in a changing climate, our first priority is the work of floodplain mapping, risk assessment, increasing public awareness and education. And so we're embarking on that even now before the launch of the strategy, but know that there's quite a ways to go. Right now, our FIMP flood hazard identification mapping program cost shared with the feds is reaching out to about 60 or 70 communities and more to go there. The next piece is flood governance. So we understand that flood involves many different levels of authorities, and that matrix can be confusing for folks at times, particularly communities that are struggling with capacity with the many things that are coming at them right now. So ideally, in the flood strategy, we'd like to build more provincial capacity to support and provide guidance and help with coordination to really leverage skills and expertise that are across the province in helping those communities that haven't been able to undertake as much as they'd like to reduce their risk. The next focuses on preparedness, response, and recovery. So we're working on continuous improvement of flood forecasting and communications. With our climate preparedness and adaptation strategy, we've already invested in some of that work, and also working with our neighbors across the border in Whatcom County and Department of Ecology in Washington State on flood forecasting in terms of the Nooksack. We know we need to enhance preparedness and coordination on those fronts. And then the final piece is investing for flood resilience. We heard very clearly in our engagement that folks are looking for more stable multi-year funding to address flood risk. Flood works in particular are very expensive. We're proposing, and you'll see this also in the intentions paper, is a multi-pronged approach of first avoiding creating new risk, then learning to accommodate flood waters where possible, doing protection measures where we need, and I'm sure you'll be talking about that in respect to your activities further in this workshop on protecting critical infrastructure, and then exploring managed retreat, but in a way that's sensitive to the community's needs. So it has to be community-led, and we're still exploring what that looks like, certainly from our experiences from the atmospheric river. Next slide, please. Tyrone, if you'd like to speak to this slide, I'd invite you to, no pressure.
Sure, I don't mind, Laura. And just before we begin, just adding that the purposing of the information you're receiving in this deck here is us trying to describe a pathway going forward. A little bit later on the deck, you'll see a bit of a description of that pathway in terms of some expected high level objectives and outcomes. So trying to tell you that this isn't canned, this isn't set in concrete right now. It's considering 9 major watersheds in the province, and look how big the Fraser watershed is, but recognizing the importance of grounding the intents of a BC flood strategy locally, particularly engaging local First Nations with local governments, with public in grounding what it is that you're seeing and hearing in this deck. So the intent is to be collaborative and to appreciate what I call is a number of instruments to bring to bear, whether it's the declaration, whether it's the calls to action, whether it's the federal UNDA action plan, because at some point the feds have to play a role, not in the strategy, but in the implementation of it. And one of the most collaborative, by far the best collaborative exercise I've participated in was the development of this strategy, going from an intentions paper towards a strategy and this process called sharing the pen, where a number of us from First Nations from throughout the province worked with Lower and team, and we'd have the strategy posted on a shareable format so that we could all add comments, questions, or do whatever, and then we'd meet regularly, discuss what it is that's gone into them. And it's by far the most productive way that we've had the ability as a BC-wide First Nations, not everybody, but voices from BC-wide in key areas of the strategy and sound things off, not only each other, but with Laura on their team as well. And it's super effective. And I think we need to advance that sharing a pen process and a lot of the other activities that we're doing with BC and Canada. So on the reflecting the cultural values aspect of it, trying to educate folks on, what do you call them, resources or natural resources. In many cases, we've got spiritual relations to those natural resources, spiritual relations to important areas of the land. We broadly call cultural values, and so you can't put a dollar value to it. Like if we have a sacred site and you want to bulldoze it over to put in a dike or something, we can't say, oh, pay us $1 million. It doesn't work that way. So a big piece of it is improving the cultural competency to have that understanding of our relation to the land around us, which brings us to connecting with rights and title holders. You'll see in the strategy when it's released, it's fully cognizant that in British Columbia, only BC First Nations have rights and title to lands and resources. So it's not Indigenous, it's not Aboriginal, it's First Nations. So for me in here, it's Stalo rights or Coast Salish rights. And we'll need the ability to, once the strategy is released, to bring that conversation down to the First Nations rights and title holders, bring it down to the local governments and regional districts, and then engage that collaboration on the ground. How do we make this work together? Because it makes sense that we work together, right? And then making the linkages. And there's a tremendous amount of other strategies happening, whether it's the watershed security strategy or others, but we've got to make linkages because we can't work in silos, right? There's all kinds of opportunities to come together and do things more efficiently and effectively. And then hammering home the place-based again, you'll see a lot of principles and values here that the provincial level makes sense at the local level, but then you need to describe what that means to you at the local level, and there will be opportunities to do that going forward. And really stressing the importance of working together. I really prefer not to have a First Nations flood strategy and then a local government flood strategy and then whatever, right? Let's do it together. Let's come together and have conversations. What are our common priorities? What are our common values? And how it is that we work together most effectively and efficiently going forward? Next slide. And back to Laura, probably.
Thank you. Yes, and we got through the process of bringing First Nations and local governments in the watersheds around the province together. We got some really rich feedback on where folks feel that we need to take our efforts to build on that flood resilience in a collaborative way. And so this slide shows you some of the elements that we took away, and I'd love to dive into each of them, but I will instead point you to the many What We Heard reports that we've got on our Engage BC site, and happy to chat offline with any of you on questions or interests that you see from this. But I would say that certainly the 5 principles that LFC have that Gillian presented to you earlier are really in alignment with where we're trying to take this work. Next slide, please. I will just drill down for the sake of this forum on a bit of what the flood strategy says about regional considerations. And Tyrone already spoke to you about that importance of place-based planning. So that's certainly a part of it. And the other aspect is that with respect to governance, we recognize the value of regional or sub-regional scale watershed planning and hope that we can be supportive of those models going forward. So really appreciate this forum setting the foundation for that potential work. Next slide, please.
Can I just add quickly, Laura?
Yes.
Just around the governance piece, I think it's an opportunity for us, like here in Upper Fraser Valley, between our communities and local governments and regional district, that over time have a discussion. What does that mean? Because I think it may be challenging for us to jump into a governance conversation right away, but we have opportunities for governors to engage and converse with each other to determine what their priorities are going forward. Because really, we want local decisions to be made, right? And for now, we're describing it as governance, but really, I think, Laura, what we're talking about is harmonizing decision-making processes and what it is that we're doing here, so that here we're those of you that are in the up and mid river, because you're on the call now, we're participating in decisions that affect us, as opposed to Victoria or Ottawa making decisions and they don't know who we are or what our priorities are. Thanks.
Next slide, please, Dan. We heard very clearly the importance of nature-based options. I'll adopt your language there, Tyrone. That they play an increased role in climate adaptation, and that we need to be working in alignment with natural processes and functions to reduce both flood and drought risk while enhancing important values, and certainly recognizing the critical element of fish in wild food security and the cultural significance of it for First Nations. So I know a lot of folks on the line here are doing a lot of work in that space.
And just adding quickly, and Laura and team, like one of the things I try to bring to a lot of what it is we're doing around resilience is links to climate adaptation, and particularly its relation to carbon, right? And if you look at the carbon value of wetlands, it's there. It's pretty steady, pretty consistent, right? And you can see over the next short while a shift from those doing carbon offsets or raising carbon sequestering, moving away a lot from the forest aspect of carbon, the green carbon, because of the severity of forest fires, right? So I'm raising at every table that this teal carbon from wetlands is much more stable. And in our area here, Laura, there's about 30,000 hectares of teal carbon, and it has a value of somewhere between 120 and $480 million if you capitalize it over time. So yes, it is fish and fish habitat, but then there's other spin-off benefits like carbon and the values of carbon it brought to the table too. Thanks.
Thanks. Indeed. Next slide, please. As Tyrone mentioned, what we're doing is we're setting a roadmap with the strategy that we hope to release soon. But it will set the foundation for further work to come. We recognize it'll take, a decade plus out to realize our full vision, but that we've got a good foundation there with the pathways and 25 actions underneath in terms of what our next moves will be. So here we're just showing a bit of an evolution over the next while on developing that work and continuing to do it in an iterative, collaborative way. Next slide, please. There we go. So I would like to express my gratitude, because this really was a partnership with our Sharing the Pen folks to put the strategy together. And happy to have had the opportunity to share the presentation with Tyrone. Thank you. And Tyrone, if you want to make any closing remarks, I'm happy for you to do so.
Maybe my last remark for now, Laura, and everybody, is the intention. One of the intentions of including us in actual real capital C co-development, it wasn't to set the things in stone for First Nations across British Columbia or for local governments, anybody else for that matter. I view this as probably the best starting place that the province could get on rolling out a BC-wide flood strategy, because we're there as a part of it. And a lot of the values that we have are common throughout the 34 different distinct nations across the province. So we're really looking forward to hearing some feedback from communities, in particular when it's released in the not too distant future. Thanks.
Okay, hi everyone again. Thank you so much to Laura, Tyrone, everyone who has set things up for us now so far. So we've been hearing a lot about the regional context, the provincial context to this conversation today. We're just going to do a quick question here to you so that we can hear a bit more from all of you who have joined us here today. And we're going to do that by way of poll just before we go for a quick break here. So there's a couple of ways that you can access this. I just put the link in the chat here for you. So you can just click on that and it'll come up on your computer, or if you have your phone handy, you can just point that at the QR code here and it'll come up on your phone. So I'm just going to share my screen here and I'll advance through this so that we can get into this question. So the question is, what has you leaning into this discussion about flood risk and resilience for the Lower Fraser? And you could think of this as a question, an interest, a challenge that you're bringing to this conversation here. Basically, what brought you here today? And so please feel free to submit your answers. And we're going to just take a quick break and we'll be back at 10:20 and we'll get going. We're going to hear from Dr. Stephanie Chang.
Hey everyone, so Dan Straker here. I'm with the Resilient Waters Project. I'm also a member of the Lower Fraser Floodplains Coalition here today. And what we wanted to do is to show off a couple of cool pieces of work that have been done in this sub-region in the mid and upriver. And so we've picked out, let me just back up our slides here. We want to pick the District of Kent and Mayor Sylvia Pranger and Rick McCamey from Lecommel First Nation to highlight some great collaborative work around flood resilience that we're seeing, and that we think aligns well with the 5 principles that were outlined earlier. And so, yeah, we just want to share this kind of cool work to inspire others. And we also know that there's lots of other cool work that you guys are doing too. So we'll have a little conversation after, I think, something like this, yeah, afterwards. So yeah, now I can turn it over to you, Mayor Pranger. If it's okay, it might be easiest if I just advance the slides for you. So just let me know when you want to advance the slide. Okay,
that would be wonderful. Thank you. This project was a long time in the making. We had been talking about this for some time, but were unable to do it simply because of finances. And this came together as a cooperative effort by a lot of people. This culvert was about 50 years old, a flapper style gate. And it was by default in the closed position and little or no, probably no flood, no fish passage at all. Just go ahead and advance the slide, please. The new one is a modern concrete box culvert, sluice box style gate, and in the open position as a default. And it restored fish passage to roughly 4 kilometers upstream for about 10 to 11 months of the year. You can move that forward. This is a location map of that is close to our town site, but in the rural area, not that far from the Fraser River. Go ahead. We had a major project, which was the upgrade of the Hammersley pump station, and EMBC generously allowed us to use the monies left over from the Hammersley pump station grant to put towards this project. Staff worked with Resilient Waters to identify additional grant monies, and a grant application was submitted to Healthy Watersheds Initiative and a new grant from the BC Real Estate Foundation. So that with that cooperation and partnership, we were able to secure an additional $700,000 in grant funding. the two grants allowed us to put monies into the same project and have dual benefit to protect salmon as well as flood restoration. Go ahead. The engineering firm that designed the project was Urban Systems, and construction by Jakes, and the concrete culverts came from Langley Concrete. Go ahead. It was a project that took a while to build, but considering the size of the project, it went really well. Go ahead. That is a look at the finished product, and it functions extremely well. We had a ribbon cutting in May of the following year. Go ahead to the next slide, please. All of the partners and neighboring community were involved. Representatives from Shem First Nation, the District of Kent, Watershed Watch and Resilient Waters, and the Real Estate Foundation, Urban Systems, EMBC, and kids from the Agassiz Christian School, who it was wonderful to use them as an education project, but also they also did a lot of tree planting around the new project. It was, for me, the best part of the whole project, yes, was getting it done, but seeing how many organizations can come together to make a successful project. Go forward. There you see the kids planting. For them, it was a huge event, as well as all of the partners. We were so pleased to be able to be together for this project. During November 21, go ahead again with a slide. During the November extreme weather event, that was only less than 6 weeks after the project was complete. It was proof of how well this project worked, and none of this was the only one that didn't overtop in that rain event. It receives the stormwater from Agassiz town site. In April of 2023, the Agassiz Harrison Observer reported that a coho salmon had been caught in the Agassiz Slough during a fish sampling by a local biologist. This was the first time since 1948. And that's exciting, knowing that it just isn't working for drainage, but it is also working as a restoration project for salmon. And it again is an example of what the value of partnerships is, and designing projects that have multiple value: fish protection, food protection, flood protection, and the people of our town site as well. I'm grateful for the project, grateful for the partnerships, and hopefully many more of these projects can happen throughout all of our areas if we work together and form partnerships. A long time ago already, former Chief Clem Seymour, who had passed away not that long ago, said if we work together, we can get a lot of things done. And I hope we can do lots more of that in the future. Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm muted. Thanks so much, Mayor Pranger, for this and sharing about it, and just for working on this excellent project and the willingness to do so. I'm going to hand it over to Rick McCamey from Lecommel First Nation. I feel like a biography or a quick bio wouldn't really do him justice, so I'll just say he has an illustrious career and life to share. So I'll hand it over to you, Rick.
Thanks, Dan. And I assume you can hear me there?
Yep, loud and clear.
Yeah, I've approached this a little bit different, and in the interest of time, I just want to go through an overview of the exciting things that Lecommel First Nation is doing. But first of all, short of the biography, I have a career with Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Retired from there, ended up with the Ministry of Education. Obviously, I don't know how to retire too well. And then from there now with Willow Creek Environmental, which is a business that my wife and I have. It's Willow Creek Environmental Services. And with that, we contract with the Lecommel First Nation, with a community that we're members of. My background and my history, my family is from the Matsqui First Nation. I just think that's important to state. But with that, just an overview of the challenges that we face here at Lecommel and what we've been working on. And we have a growing team here, and for all the right reasons. There's so many things that we need to deal with. Lecommel is blessed with 10 reserve lands, if we want to call it blessed. I mean, it's difficult to say that because, as we know, in time immemorial, Lecommel lands were much, much broader than the 10 reserve lands that we have. And in those 10 reserve lands, 9 of them are on the floodplain. They're at the lowest gradient in the Fraser Valley, in the region here. And they are impacted severely, or impacted from the Fraser River and the rising water of the Fraser River. And that's important to say because like anybody else with freshet, we suffer the same kind of challenge. As a matter of fact, one of our reserve lands is down to just a mere sliver and barren in the middle of the Fraser River now, which was connected in time prior to infrastructure going in. But I want to take some time actually to explain IR number 8, which is our Halacton Reserve. It's the only reserve land that's perched above the valley floor. And one would think because it's perched above the valley floor, that would be the place to develop. And we do have a substantial residential area. Our community centers are there. Our main office is there. Our health and delivery is there. Our emergency operations center for the community, not just Lecommel community, but the community of DeRoche, Lake Arrow, and Lecommel. That's the emergency operations center, and certainly it was activated in 2021. But it's the reserve that we have some of our greatest challenges for flooding, and it's perched on the hillside. And I think that's important to note because so many of our challenges with our reserve lands are, first of all, in the valley floor, which puts them at risk to the rising waters of the Fraser River and the challenges that we have with the Fraser River. But so many more of our reserve lands are perched or sitting at the toes of the radical slopes. And the result of that is that we end up with flooding on an almost annual basis now. Used to be that we would look back, and if you look historically back at the DeRoche Creek, Barrasso Creek, Pie Creek, all of those watersheds that are coming off of that south-facing slope, those impacts, those floods, those challenges that we have was maybe 1 in 10, but now it's an annual event. And so 2021 was actually a double-edged sword because it had us recognize that, and everybody else recognized that. And it offered the opportunity for Lecommel to begin to develop capacity to help present their case and have it recognized so well that partnerships, collaborative approaches began to come around. And with that, we have also the provincial government, federal government, the watershed tables coming together. So it was time, in some ways, it was time perfect to help us finally move forward with the challenges that we have. So I want to start with that. The collaborative approach is so important. LACAML is involved at watershed tables, technical tables, steering committees on a number of watersheds where we have reserve lands and throughout the region. And through that, we've met some wonderful community people, professionals in the field, local governments, and we've all come together and recognized how much better we can be together. And I think Tyrone and Laura spelled that out well, and this act is a good segue into what we're doing. But those collaborative approaches and partnerships have gone miles to support LACAML in moving projects forward. And we have many of them, and I'll kind of blaze through them in a second here. I kind of got away from what I do have in notes here. But you know, I think that's important to note. And I think I need to actually maybe put a feather out to CP Rail. We have a relationship that's growing incredibly well with CP Rail, CPKC now. And I know that that's always been a challenge, and they want to be supportive. They want to help. They understand that they are impacted as much as we are. And through these challenges and avulsions that we're seeing in the slopes that are creating the challenges that we have for flooding down below, CP Rail is affected as well. So what we've done is we've sat down. What we are doing at LACAML is developing flood models or flood management plans to support us with the watershed models that we're putting in to make better decisions as we move forward. And part of those decisions, part of those developments of those plans are with partners like CP Rail, who recognize that they're facing the same problems. MOTI, same thing. They're sitting at the table. 20 years ago, if I would have been told that we would be sitting at a table with these partners or with these folks and collaborating together to find a result that would work for all of us, I would say that's just not possible as a First Nations person. But certainly it is, and we see that today. I didn't expect to see that in my lifetime. I'm over the year of 65 by some years now. But I'm not ready to retire because I'm excited to see this as it rolls out and as we move forward with it. That's the excitement that's here. And, you know, a lot of it due to the work of Mariah and Jillian and Tyrone and EPS, but all of us together. I think we all should pat ourselves on the back to keep driving this forward. And certainly local government, the provincial government, and the federal government, and becoming more involved. So I just wanted to share that first. Projects that we are so involved with, they're driven by professionals. Kerwood Lydell, Urban Systems, they've been mentioned here. Certainly Patrick Wiley is part of the group here today. But many, many more. We are working together to find better results for it. And where we are is with, we're looking at full models of the waterways, the Nokomin outflow, the Hatzic Lake, and the challenges through the Hatzic Valley, of course, in Sumas, but I'll let them speak on that one. We're looking at models, but we're also looking into that mid-slope and setting up hydrometric, better data collection methods to help us understand why is the water the way that it is. We're working with MOTI and the infrastructure that's down below our reserve land. So the water is coming from off reserve, from the impacts of that mid-slope or in that mid-slope from, I mean, I don't want to point at logging. I don't want to point at mining, although they're all part of the problem. It's really climate change that we're dealing with and the challenges of climate change. But it takes all of us to find a way to get to resilience. And resilience in a lot of ways scares me. I think we're using that word far too soon. How do we become resilient when we still haven't understood how do we adapt to the challenges that we have? And to adapt, we need better information. We need to understand what it is we're adapting to before we can get to resilience. And I think that's what these forums are doing. They're helping us get to that place. And you know, hats off to all of us for being here and being a part of that solution. But in the Hatzic Valley, we're busy working with the communities in the Hatzic Valley, working with CP Rail and MOTI, the communities themselves, all of us sitting together to look at ways that we can develop a flood management plan that's going to work back there. And we have a lot of challenges. Not only are we dealing with the sediment depositions off of the mid slope that have historically been a challenge back there, but a challenge that was somewhat manageable, although with climate change, it's becoming more difficult to manage. But we're also dealing with infills that are taking place and a new sediment that's compounding and augmenting the challenge of flooding, the loss of conveyance of water, loss of flood storage, loss of the ability from water to get from that toe of the slope where it's releasing into the habitated areas, and then getting out to the Fraser River so that it can get out to the St. Louis Sea. All kinds of challenges there. DeRoche Creek, and the North Nacomin Waterway, which historically was DeRoche Creek, changed by CP Rail. When CP Rail came in, they built their rail bed in the bed of the creek because that's where there was some foundation for them to build in through that area, forever altering the way that DeRoche Creek flowed. And losing and taking away flood storage and fish passage and so many other things into an extensive wetland that used to exist. And then flowing it directly out to the Nacomin Slough below that railway. I think we're covering, and Patrick can correct me here, but it's about 380 meters from the infrastructure down into the slough. But with that and the more radical drop of grade through that stretch, the water is shooting out and is actually eroding away Highway 7 and taking out Highway 7. So that's kind of the innovative piece when we get all of our minds together on how can we do things, how can we be more innovative, how can we find corrections that nature-based solutions can take over for us as we move into the long term. And in that case, and I'm jumping around, but there's so many exciting things taking place. And that's why I say 2021 was a double-edged sword. But we've designed, or NHC, Kerwood Lydell, Lacamo First Nation, and other partners at the table designed wood reef system to actually strengthen the toe, strengthen the Highway 7 dike on the opposite side of DeRoche Slough, where the DeRoche Creek empties out and has taken the delta right across and actually taken away almost completely the connection of DeRoche Slough, essentially turning DeRoche Slough into 3 different lakes. And then wood deflector berms that are being put in. And again, it's quite a lot of ingenuity, a lot of cutting edge stuff to deflect the water back into the mid flow and protecting the deteriorating North Nacomin diking system, or the North Nacomin diking district, which protects a lot of the community of DeRoche. So those are kind of the innovative things that come together when we're working together. To get to that, and I think, again, 2021, we can point out has been a great value for us, was the acceptance and understanding, belief, and belief, I think, is the critical word of traditional knowledge. I believe, from my experience and the work that I've done, up until that time, traditional knowledge was just a talk. We talked a lot about it. We talked the talk and did a pretty good job of talking the talk, but we did not walk the walk. I still don't think we're walking the walk as well as what we should be walking the walk. And I think where we see functioning groups that are working extremely well with innovative plans moving forward to find nature-based solutions when possible, those are coming together because we're walking the walk. We have us all sitting at the table looking at historically what that watershed was, how that watershed could be. And I think that's a lot of the success that we're in, the floodgates that we're putting in that are very similar to what Sylvia just presented here in the North Nacomin Slough, to reintroduce fish passage into a wetland that essentially has been gone since the infrastructure and dikes were put in place. And it's exciting because Sylvia, I'm hoping by this time next year or the year after, I'll be able to report the same thing, that we're seeing Coho and Joe's Lake and the back lake, and we're seeing connectivities through the rest of that wetland as we move on, and these gates and new culverts and the rest of this project continue to come to life to grow that. And I don't know how much more I can say, but the importance of us to continue to work together, to believe our local knowledge. And I'm not just pointing at the local knowledge, traditional knowledge of our First Nations, the elders of our First Nations, the stories that we have that actually drive us into those 7 generations of the future. But I'm talking about as well the local knowledge of our settlers. We're working in the region that I'm so involved with in the work that I do with Lower First Nation, with settlers that are 5 generations, 6 generations deep now. And the knowledge that they bring to the table from their stories that are told, and most often written, but not always. And I point to Thorn Yeomans, Dan, and I know you'll nod your head, and Patrick, you as well, with what we've learned through Thorn Yeomans here in the community. It's a non-Indigenous settler, but he brings knowledge to the table that helps us with our everyday thought, our everyday. The books really help us with understanding just how we got to put the plan together and how we actually get the funding from the province and from the federal government. It's the traditional knowledge that helps us implement it. They help us with understanding what is the history of it, what do we need to achieve, where are we hoping to get to, and how can we even be better than what it was, even though these gigantic infrastructures are in the way of creating a natural habitat. But in saying that, it is succeeding. We're finding ways to naturalize what we have, find flood storage, get better conveyance, working together. Had we have continued down the path that we were prior to 2021, I can absolutely certain that we would not be where we are today. We would still be struggling and looking back and wondering, where did we go wrong? How do we get this rail back on the rails and moving forward? So I guess the message that I hope I got across is that the relationships is everything. The relationships, the communication, the believing of the communication and relationships between us all, whether you learned it in a Western school book, as many of us have here, or whether you learned it through your traditional knowledge or through the elders in your community. All of it is important to get a positive final result. And I just want to close with Department of Fisheries and Oceans. I was sent to the Red River Valley a number of years back in the, I don't want to date myself, but it was early in the 80s, for flooding that was taking place there. And in the back of the room, when I went into communities like that to start a process, to work towards correction of the challenge that we were facing, I always wanted to know, what is it that is known and remembered by a local community? So the school book is going to tell me where rock should go, how much sediment should come out, those kinds of things. Local community is going to tell me what I'm trying to build it to. And there was one fellow in the back of the room that was just nattering. And I finally stopped the discussion and I explained to him, please share what you have. Everybody's got a voice. Everybody's voice is important. And he said, I don't know what you guys don't understand. He said, the mountains just don't know how to drink the water anymore. And I thought, at that time it was mountains don't know how to drink the water. So right away I'm thinking, okay, well, the water's it's not permeating, it's not moving down as it should. That was my educated mind defining what he had to say. But as I look at it today and I think, we didn't even start talking climate change. We didn't start working towards climate change until Tamsin, you'd be better at this than me, but we weren't serious about it until we got 2010. But here we were in the early 1980s, and we have an elder in a community telling us that water's coming off of that slope different than water used to come off that slope. If you ask me, that's better than any school book, because school book didn't give us anything on that at that time. I'm not saying that school books aren't important. They absolutely are. They help my career be as successful as what it is. But I am saying that the blending of that knowledge from the traditional values, the understanding of what it was historically that's been passed down orally for tens of thousands of years, is equally as important as what we learn in school books. I want to end with that because, hopefully that's having everybody here understand, first of all, how pleased I am that is implemented in the work that we're doing today, or at least we're getting better at it. but also to have everybody else understand that isn't Indigenous, how important it is to have that voice at the table. Because that voice at the table is knowledge that isn't measured. There isn't check boxes that tells us that that deserves this degree or this certification or this amount of value put to it. What we need to understand is it doesn't need the checkbox. It is. It's degreeable. It gives us a degree of thought that's better than the thought that we would have otherwise. And it gives us knowledge that is better than the school books that we're dealing with or learning out of today. Not saying that they're not good, the school books today. They are, but there's that other piece of knowledge that somehow we need to figure out that to have it recognized better than what it is. Check boxes, maybe. I'm not sure that fits with the Indigenous or the traditional ways, but certainly something that allows for that to be recognized as knowledge that should be shared, should be part of every decision that we make as we move forward. I hope I covered off everything. It's an exciting time to be doing the work that I'm doing, for sure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rick. And I feel like we could really spend a lot of time listening and learning from you. And maybe that's really what it's about, is just getting better at listening rather than check boxes and learning from people that are as knowledgeable as you. So just thank you so much for sharing. Just to take it to our next little bit here, we've got a time for some conversation with y'all. I just need to pull up the screen so it has all the questions for us here. Yeah, so we're going to put you into some breakout groups for about 15 minutes so that we can talk. Like, we showed off a couple of cool initiatives that have been done, and or many initiatives in Rick's case, but just about highlighting collaborative work that aligns with the 5 principles we've been talking about earlier. This is an opportunity for you to get into groups, and if you already know each other, then that's great. Then you can advance your conversations even further. But this is also an opportunity to meet your neighbors if you haven't really yet, or have that conversation that we don't always make time for. So we're looking for what are some initiatives that you know of that are doing this work well, aligning with those 5 principles, and what opportunities you see where we could do it even better, or even ideas for quick wins and next steps that you're seeing in the area, in your immediate local kind of place-based area. So yeah, without further ado, I think we're going to launch you into some breakout groups for about 15 minutes.
Welcome back, everyone. We'll just wait for folks to tumble back into the room here. All right, great to see everyone's faces as well. We haven't seen some of you with your videos on yet, so nice to see a few more of you. Hope that was an interesting discussion and that you got to learn a lot from each other about what's going on or what the aspirations are in these subregions. And we're going to be back in discussion in just a little bit. We're going to move now from this discussion to the focus on critical infrastructure and essential services. And so I'm going to hand it over first to Dr. Stephanie Chang from UBC, who is going to give us an orientation to critical infrastructure and essential services. What are we talking about? How does that relate to the region? And some good examples as well to illustrate this, to hold in mind. And then we're going to talk about it for this subregion after that. So I'll hand it over to you. Welcome, Stephanie.
All right, thank you, Erica, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. Just a quick intro. I'm Stephanie Chang. I'm a professor at UBC. I'm with the School of Community and Regional Planning and also the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability. And I'm also the co-director of the Master of Engineering Leadership Program in Urban Systems, which focuses on infrastructure systems. In terms of my research, my area of research is actually on disasters, disaster risk and resilience. So my work pretty much involves studying what happens in actual disasters, whether they be earthquakes or tsunamis or floods, etc. as well as what could happen and how this risk could be reduced. So I was asked to give a high-level overview of critical infrastructure issues and floods, and I'm really delighted to do so. Let me just share my screen now. Okay. Sorry, let me just adjust my screen here. Okay. So one of the reasons I'm really happy to talk about this subject is because I find that a big lesson from studying disasters is that critical infrastructure resilience is really key to community resilience. So let me start with, here we go. Let me start with floods. I think for a lot of people, when they think about floods, they think about something like this. They have an image of something like this in mind, which is a lot of inundation to people's houses and homes and properties and people having to leave their homes and so on, being displaced. But the 2021 atmospheric river flood, I think, was a wake-up call for many people in BC that highlighted the vulnerability of transportation infrastructure systems. So the Lower Mainland, or at least Metro Vancouver, was famously cut off from the rest of Canada to the east for a time because of all the highway and railway lines that were disrupted through the Fraser Valley. And of course, for everyone in the Fraser Valley, local transportation was a very serious problem as well. So transportation is clearly critical infrastructure. But what does that really mean? And what else can we consider to be critical infrastructure? Let me talk about that for a bit. A few years ago, I looked into definitions of infrastructure and critical infrastructure by different organizations in the US and Canada. I won't read them all here, but for example, the American Society of Civil Engineers or Infrastructure Canada, our federal government, and other places, other organizations that think about this. And I pretty much found that in terms of defining what is critical infrastructure, or even what is infrastructure, there are a lot of different definitions out there. The sectors at the top that you can see in red are the ones that pretty much everybody agrees are either infrastructure or critical infrastructure. And that's, of course, transportation, but also energy, like electric power in particular, water, wastewater. Pretty much everybody agrees on that. But the other sectors, whether it's telecom or healthcare or emergency services or even food systems, are sometimes considered infrastructure by some definitions and sometimes not. So it's not that, I mean, we all agree that they're very important for communities, but whether or not they're considered infrastructure is a bit inconsistent across the board. And it doesn't even get to issues like whether these systems are owned by the public sector or by the private sector, for example. So rather than a list of infrastructure systems or sectors, I find it more helpful to think in terms of their defining characteristics. So this is my take on things here. But basically, some of the key aspects of infrastructure that makes them infrastructure are that, number one, they provide essential services. So they consequently, they affect all sectors of society. And also they tend to be really taken for granted until they fail. And then we realize how essential they are. A second characteristic is that they tend to be geographically extensive networks, which means that they also serve very large populations. And that's another reason why when they're disrupted, they also affect a lot of people and have major consequences. A third characteristic is that these systems are often interdependent. So that, for example, water systems often rely on electric power to run the pumps. So that means that risk management rather requires a lot of coordination as well, which is challenging. And long service lives. So these are systems, structures that last for decades. So there are a lot of issues of outdated design and maintenance issues, deterioration issues, those kinds of aspects that also characterize infrastructure and the related problems. Okay, so one definition that I like personally, this one comes from the U.S. National Research Council's report on sustainable critical infrastructure systems. Is in this report, they say critical infrastructure systems are defined as the water, wastewater, power, meaning electric power, transportation, and telecommunication systems, without which buildings emergency response systems and other infrastructure cannot operate as intended. So they are the lifeline systems that physically tie together metropolitan areas, communities, and neighborhoods, and facilitate the growth of local, regional, and national economies. These interdependent systems work together to provide the essential services of a modern society, be it water, power, mobility, connectivity. And what I really like about the definition is actually that last bit about providing essential services. Okay, so why don't we take a little while to think about infrastructure vulnerability in floods specifically, and think about what happens to infrastructure systems when you have a major flood disaster. So for this next little bit, I'm going to step away from no doubt what's top of mind for you all, which is the 2021 atmospheric river floods in BC, and look at a few examples from flood disasters in other areas to kind of get us thinking about what could happen in catastrophic events, especially in urbanized areas, to infrastructure. So let's see, we'll start with this one. This is Hurricane Katrina. I think many people remember Hurricane Katrina, even though it was almost 20 years ago now. And in Katrina, as we all know, the big infrastructure failure that made a storm an absolute catastrophe for New Orleans was the failure of the flood protection system. So when the storm surge hit the city, there were many flood walls that failed. Flood waters surged into 80% of the city. Over 1,000 people were killed. There was disproportionate impact on low-income Black populations, and it was by far the costliest natural disaster in U.S. history up until that point. So even if, I guess what I'm trying to say is, even if flood protection systems aren't not included in many definitions of critical infrastructure, clearly they should be for flood hazard. Okay, so the next few pictures I'm going to show are going to all be from Hurricane Sandy in New York City, 2012. Also another major coastal flooding disaster. And let me see, there we go. So some aspects of infrastructure vulnerability in flooding events, I think, are pretty obvious, right? So the first picture at the top here is we have an airport, so LaGuardia Airport, that was closed due to flooding on its runway. So low-lying airport inundation. The second image is of a major road underpass that was flooded from floor to ceiling because of elevation. And the third one is a ferry terminal that was also flooded. And obviously the ferry system couldn't work for a while. So those are pretty obvious, I would say, and they have to do with inundation. The next few may be a little bit less obvious, but also very real in terms of consequences and impacts on society. So let's see. The one at the top right here is a blackout. So pretty much all of lower southern Manhattan had a blackout in Hurricane Sandy because when the floodwaters inundated several electric power substations. And in total, I think something like 2 million people lost electric power. So among the many consequences of electric power outage are that hospitals, for example, hundreds of patients in hospitals had to be evacuated under emergency conditions when the main power source was lost and their backup generators failed. In high-rise buildings, elevators didn't run. Apparently, most taps above the 7th floor went dry because water pumps had no power. The power outage also caused public transit systems to shut down, so people couldn't get to work. The fuel supply was disrupted. Refineries and terminals were damaged. They also lost power. And pipelines were shut down. There was widespread gas station closures, as you can sort of infer from the picture there at the bottom. And so lack of fuel made it basically very challenging in the emergency situation for ambulances to respond to emergencies. It made it harder for utility workers to restore electric power. It delayed doctors and nurses who were trying to treat patients. It hampered relief and rescue efforts in the hardest hit neighborhoods. A lot of consequences. This is just a few, and I'm sure in the Fraser Valley you have many others also that you're thinking about from your experiences of flooding. Okay, and I want to highlight one more that's less obvious, I would say, but also very real, and that's impacts on businesses from infrastructure disruption and floods. So I would say that on this point, basically my point is that utility and transportation loss is a really important cause of losses in disasters to businesses. And we've known this for a very long time. So research is really clear on this. The earliest study that I know of was about 30 years ago, 1993 Des Moines flood, Great Midwest flood. In this business survey, they had over 1,000 businesses reply. And basically they found that about 15% of those businesses suffered actual flood damage, inundation to their property. But 80% had no water, 40% had no sewer, 33% had no electricity, no phone, etc. 42% of the businesses had to close for some period of time. And the number one reason that they gave for having to close is because of loss of utilities. So this is something that is seen in a lot of flooding events as a consequence of infrastructure disruption, these economic impacts. Okay, so if I could, I just want to summarize the various things that I'm trying to talk about here in a diagram. So flooding inundates places, communities, and it causes a lot of impacts. And these include everything from people impacts, so deaths, injuries, people being displaced from their homes, damage to buildings and contents, environmental damage, business interruption, economic losses, and of course, infrastructure damage. So that's straightforward. But the infrastructure part, infrastructure part comes in because infrastructure damage causes infrastructure service losses, which then compound. So there are interdependencies between infrastructures, so that if you lose one essential service, it causes further impact. So for example, loss of power leading to loss of water, leading to the need to evacuate hospitals, for example, or maybe loss of power leading to wastewater treatment plants that then need to release untreated sewage, large volumes into water bodies and causing contamination. So lots of examples there of interdependencies. This can also lead to further impacts, and it can also exacerbate the immediate impacts of the flooding anyway. So for example, if there are bridge closures, the bridge closures would lead to massive travel time delays for repair crews that would then be less able to get around the region to fix a lot of the damage, for example. So many examples that we can think of. Okay, so what does this look like in the Lower Mainland? Here, I think, there are many issues that I'm sure you're all thinking about and are aware of and probably have experienced firsthand. So I'm just listing a few that come to my mind. There are many others. And I won't even talk about all of them. I just want to highlight a couple that I think are particularly relevant and significant for our region. So one is the critical infrastructure corridor, this low-lying coast, this critical infrastructure corridor through the Fraser Valley. As we know from 2021, highways and railways through this infrastructure corridor are vulnerable in flooding. It's also worth pointing out that other infrastructure services like natural gas, electric power, our supply in here in Metro Vancouver comes through the Fraser Valley as well, through the same infrastructure corridor. So a lot of co-located infrastructure through this narrow corridor susceptible to disruption and flooding. And with us flooding or landslides, we know that both happen. And the other issue I wanted to highlight is governance. So on the governance side, there are many authorities and entities that are involved in critical infrastructure provision, as you all know, including many municipalities, First Nations, the province, different utilities, a lot of coordination challenges. So in terms of priorities, I think many people are familiar with the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction and the 4 priority setting ways of thinking here. I think we can just basically talk about this in the context of infrastructure. So understanding infrastructure risk, strengthening infrastructure risk governance, investing in infrastructure risk reduction, and enhancing infrastructure preparedness and to build back better. In terms of that first one, understanding infrastructure risk, I just want to make one point, which is that methods and approaches do exist for better understanding infrastructure risk than what we understand now. So it is possible to develop better understandings of how the infrastructure in our region is vulnerable to flooding, what kind of outages that we might expect, how long these outages might be, where these outages might be, what kinds of economic and social impacts we can credibly expect in a major flood. There are methodologies out there. And other jurisdictions have done this already. For example, the city of San Francisco did an infrastructure interdependency study 10 years ago. And there are other examples we can point to. So basically, we can draw in part on methods that have already been applied, including methods applied to other hazards in our region, such as earthquake. Okay, so that's understanding risk. And in terms of investing in infrastructure risk reduction, I just want to make the point that it's also very well known, well documented, that investing in infrastructure for disaster risk reduction has huge benefits. So let's see, a few years ago, the US federal government, the Congress, wanted to know if all the money that they were investing in infrastructure mitigations was actually worth it. So in a benefit cost analysis sense. So they commissioned a big study. And in this study, they looked at all of the federal investments, and they found that for investments against flood and wind hazards for infrastructure, basically almost all the projects were cost effective, even without considering climate change. The median benefit cost ratio was 6-1, which means that for every dollar of investment in infrastructure mitigation, it was yielding $6 in benefits. Even something as mundane as just elevating the electrical equipment in a water treatment plant had a benefit cost ratio of 10-1. So it was hugely cost effective when the societal impacts were taken into account. And that includes reduced business interruption. It includes the reduced number of people that would have to be evacuated and displaced from their homes. Okay, the last thing I want to say is in terms of another useful resource that I think is useful, again, from the US. This is a community resilience planning guide for buildings and infrastructure systems. And it's been pretty well applied in many places across the border. The crux of this guide, I would say, is this diagram, which is encouraging communities to get together and to think in terms of recovery times for critical infrastructure. So these blue boxes with the X's are an illustration of where we are now, and the green boxes are where we want to be. So for example, let's say take the water system. Maybe after some evaluation, the community figures out that the water service would be, in a major flood, would be disrupted for 4 to 8 weeks, credibly, after a major flood. And maybe they figured that this is absolutely, not acceptable. And where we want to be is 90% available within 1 to 3 days. So the gap here is obviously what needs to be addressed. And the talking through of what the objectives are helps to define what needs to be done and the priorities. So closing the gap is really the essence of this community resilience planning guide. Okay, so I just want to end here, and I hope that this has been a little bit helpful in your discussions about how to make critical infrastructure more resilient, to make communities more resilient in our region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Greatly appreciate you taking the time and walking us through just framing this discussion for folks and getting us ready to jump into it ourselves. So we're going to hear next from Tamsin Lyle, and Tamsin, you're welcome to share your screen. Excellent. Thanks. Take it away.
I will take it away. We're trying to make up some time here. So my name is Tamsin Lyle. I'm an engineer and principal at Edgewater Consulting here on the unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. And I am here today to set you up for your next conversation, where you will be speaking about critical infrastructure in this region. So I've got a few slides to provide some context on language and some terminology, as well as some an overview of some work that we've been doing as the LFFC to try and understand what is important in this region and how might a place-based thinking be different from just taking the definitions, for example, that Stephanie has provided for us. So starting with a triangle, Troy, I can see your face for some reason, so I want Troy to do the triangle for me. triangle, everybody do the triangle, thank you. This is one way to describe risk, where risk is the area inside your triangle. And it's a useful way and a simple way to think about risk. On one side of the triangle, we have hazard, in this case, flood. It's the bad thing. And if we think about that regionally, here today, this is a map of flood hazard across the region. From the Fraser River, there's also flood hazard from the ocean, from creeks, etc. But this is where, water intersects with land. The next side of the triangle is exposure. So this is really all about the things that we care about that would interact with that water. And again, one example here is just looking at people, population. I think everybody can agree that people are important. And there are people exposed to flood hazard across the region. There's about 350,000 people currently living in the floodplains of the Lower Fraser Valley, and we know that that is changing. So that's the exposure. So we've got people on top of the hazard. Next part of our triangle is the vulnerability or susceptibility of those people, those things that we care about getting damaged. Some people get more, some people are more vulnerable to flooding than others, small children, for example, versus an adult male. And the same goes for infrastructure that has high electrics versus infrastructure that has low electrics. But there's an advantage, there's something that we can do about the vulnerability. And I think this is an important thing for us to consider. If we think about vulnerability as being a mix of our sort of adaptive capacity, we can respond to this. And if we think about people, yesterday it was raining. Most of us did not leave the house naked. In fact, we put on our rain boots, we've used our umbrellas, we used our raincoats. We made ourselves have a greater capacity and be less vulnerable to floods and rain. So that gets us to our risk triangle. We understand risk. Well, we don't understand risk. We can understand the concept of risk. But what we need to do as a region is to really understand what is risk in this region. And we do that through something called a risk assessment, which is effectively just the evaluation of each of those sides of the triangle in a systematic manner. But if we want to get at the risk that matters in a place-based way to the place that we are here, we need to make sure that these assessments really reflect what we care about, what risk means to us in this region. So what do we care about? And I'm just going to take you on a quick example of a project that was done in the city of Vancouver about 10 years ago, where we thought about what we cared about. But I'll show you what happened in terms of the risk assessment. So this is an example here of sitting down with a group of folks like yourselves and asking the question, what do you care about? Big map of flood on the ground. What is in the way of that water and what is vulnerable to that water? And this is the list that was created from that work. And it's quite an extensive list. It probably isn't nearly as extensive as it should have been, but it's a big, long list. But then we went away and took that information and said, okay, this is what we care about. Here's the data we have to support that conversation. And here are the methods we have to actually consider what happens when a roadway gets wet, when a person gets wet, when a gas station gets wet. And unfortunately, what we found is that little teeny tiny place in the middle of the Venn diagram there. So at the end of the day, this is the same picture again. The things in red were what we were able to do a detailed risk assessment on. And the things in purple were the things that we were able to sort of comment on quantitatively at a high level, and everything else we had to do qualitatively to make sure that we were really considering what matters in the place that was the city of Vancouver to get to a point where we're making decisions that make sense for us. Oh, I was doing so well on time. Okay, and then I slipped my finger. Anyhow, so one way to do this in terms of a risk assessment is try to think about exposure for the place that we're in. And there are some standard models for what we care about and that we need to be thinking about in a risk assessment in terms of that exposure: people, financial disruption, business disruption that just Stephanie was just speaking about, the environment, culture, obviously health and safety of individual people. But our challenge is that what we care about bucket is quite big, and what we can do things about is small. And we need to be able to like mush these things together and do a better job of thinking about what we care about when we're thinking about risk assessment. And one thing that the LFFC has been doing for the last 6 or 7 months or so is having conversations in the region. And we've done some very preliminary work to develop what we're calling the receptors of risk for this region. And this is a sort of a different approach that's place-based in the region to try and understand what we care about here. And it's different than those international models. It includes consideration of community as well as individual people, for example, because we kept hearing that community and the whole was actually more important than individuals. It includes consideration of food sovereignty and sustainability. And importantly, it also considers the idea that we need to think about today, but we also need to think about the past as well as many generations into the future. So with that lens in mind, critical infrastructure in the region, what is already here that we define as critical infrastructure, and what does this mean in context of the region, and what should we be defining as critical infrastructure in this region? So this is just, a standard list. I admit that someone in my office did this using ChatGPT and all of our internal reports and asked it, what is critical infrastructure? And this is the list that it came up with, and we added a few things to it. So these are the kind of things that we are typically thinking about. These are the kind of things that Stephanie was speaking about. But we've also added some important consideration for salmon, for example. Is the river, the Fraser River, actually critical infrastructure because it supports that idea of food sovereignty and sustainability? And to support you in this conversation, we have done some quick mapping here of standard critical infrastructure elements across the floodplain, using the Fraser River floodplain mostly to determine where things are exposed to flood or not. Red is exposed, gray is not exposed. And so that, as Stephanie was saying, there's all of these things that are in the floodplain, and in this upper region here, we have these corridors of very important pieces of infrastructure that pass over the floodplain. So we need to be considering that. But a reminder that in this context, we need to be thinking about the place that is here. So what is critical infrastructure in this place? And that's the conversation we're going to launch you into right now, I think. So hopefully Erica will give you a little more context.
Great. Thank you so much, Tamsin. And again, for just framing things up in such a relatable and accessible way. So appreciate that very much. You can stop sharing.
I'm trying to. Yep, I'm on it. Here we go.
Great. And Dan, if you could bring up the other slides, that would be excellent. So we're just going to get you set up for the main event here, which is a conversation about critical infrastructure and essential services. We'll break you into small groups again, and your facilitator will walk you through a process in that group. The first question will be around what are those essential services and critical infrastructure that can be disrupted during a flood. Things you've experienced, things that could happen that you're concerned about in your community or in this region. And we want to think both about what are the more local things, but particularly about what do we have in common in the subregion and even in the region. So really thinking what we want to move towards here is where are those common elements or the things where we should really together focus our attention. Next slide. So first, we'll just put those on the paper, so to say, the digital paper. And then the second step here is then to step back and think about, for example, some of those defining characteristics that Stephanie was mentioning about what makes something critical infrastructure or more critical than other things. And so we'll have you, with your facilitators, help identify which of these things are critical and which can we tolerate. Remember that the one she showed towards the end that showed the response time or the recovery time of things when they're affected. So that's what we're thinking about. Which of them can we tolerate having disrupted for some time, and which are really critical and we really need to close that gap. And then you'll just have some discussion about what comes up there. And the intention here is to come up with some recommendations for where should we start as a subregion and as a region. And we'll gather those all together from this. Wanted to mention we're not taking time here to do report backs from the pieces where you're having discussion and contributing, just for the reasons of time. However, we will be putting together a report from these sessions. So everything that you're sharing, we're taking notes on, detailed notes, and we will be part of forming what comes out of these sessions and helping to guide what the next steps will be in taking this forward. So I just wanted to mention that as well. All right, if we're ready, then I will send you off into your groups, and Tamsin has put the maps in the chat here too. So if you want to take a look at those yourselves, you're welcome to grab those and open that up. And Mariah will send us off into the groups. Oh, all right, welcome back, everyone. Just wait a moment while everyone arrives. We were saying earlier, this is the one thing we can control on Zoom is the breakout groups, but it leads to whiplash. So apologies anyone who got cut off in the process there. Always someone who's in the middle of sharing something really important when we get cut off. Yeah, if there is anything that you didn't get to finish, please feel free to put it in the chat. You can private message your facilitator or one of us, or just put it in the main chat. If there's something that you want to make sure is noted, we'll definitely be gathering notes from everywhere you want to leave them. So yeah, so please feel free to do that. So we're coming close to the end here, and hope you guys had the chance for some great conversation. We realize this this is a first conversation across the region of this nature, and of course there's a lot more to do, a lot further to go. We need to do the technical studies. We need to bring together the various pieces of this to actually do a proper risk assessment in relation to critical infrastructure. But it also helps to what we're hoping from today is that we will gather some insight into what are some of those criteria, what are some of the things we need to be keeping in mind in how we make the choices between these things, and as a group, where are we thinking the key priorities might be. So I'm going to turn to Dan. Again, we don't have time for report backs, unfortunately, but we will gather all of those notes and get them back to you in a report following up from this session. And Dan right now is going to just speak a little bit again to the sub-regional approach that we're taking, and then we're going to get some input from you on that. And then we'll come to Chief McNeil for some closing remarks at the end. Dan?
Yeah, hey everyone, thanks Erica. Yeah, so just to say quickly, so today it was a new sort of experiment. If you've been at our past forums in July 2022 and then June 2023, we were meeting as a whole region. We thought we'd switch it up a bit. So yesterday we were meeting as the Coastal River Tidal region, and now meeting with mid and upriver folks. This is really to kind of get at those different scales of working together. And this is really maybe in the middle of the scale. So we wanted to hear from you guys, like, how did that work for you? Is it helpful to be meeting at this scale and the regional scale? Should we be meeting at even smaller scales? This is the kind of thing we want you guys to dig into with this next little bit. So I hope that helps set that up without sounding too confusing or vague. So yeah, I think that was it. Erica, anything else I should throw in there?
Just sounds good. Yeah, so again, we're going to go to the poll. So if you have it up on your screen already in another window, you can just go back to that same window. And if you don't, Dan, could you put the link in the chat again here for folks, or you can just point your phone at the QR code here, and I'll switch over to that. So yeah, your input in shaping a sub-regional approach. So the first question is, what do you see as some of the benefits and opportunities of working together at a sub-regional scale? Thinking about your experience today or other ways that, other experiences that you might have had, what do you see as the benefits and opportunities of coming together sub-regionally? And
it's not in the chat yet. There we go.
There we go. Sorry about that. Okay. So yeah, take a minute as the responses come in. We'll see them up on the screen here. So once you've responded, you can also take a look at the Zoom window and see what others are sharing. Okay, so hearing from folks about the value of being able to hear from each other, letting each other know what's going on at a community level, building relationships, sharing knowledge, sharing data and ways of approaching and solving these issues. Recognizing some of our shared needs, for example, needing some shared risk assessments between communities. And yeah, some more about getting to know what others are doing, learning from each other's experience. Great. So yeah, really that sharing of knowledge and learning and building of relationships are some of the things that we're hearing here. Okay, so feel free to finish off and I'll go to the next question here as well. Oh, we've got a few more. I'll just pause here. So great. Okay, yeah. So again, just more of the same themes there. So the next question is, what do you see, if any, are the drawbacks or challenges of working together at a sub-regional scale? And you might here also want to comment on what things might better be addressed at a different scale, a larger scale, a smaller scale. What things are more appropriate to a different scale? We have a few responses coming in so far, and some like having different priorities or competing for local resources, local funding, having different priorities, needs, capacities. So some of these seem like the challenges, but also the reason why we might need to work together at a sub-regional level. Decisions aren't made fast enough. So yeah, we know this at all scales that, and especially when we come together across jurisdictions, that it does take more time to do this, the time for listening, the time for building relationships. Someone saying they don't see the drawbacks. They're really seeing that we're stronger together. And we have a couple of people saying that actually, and when the platform is open to speak and to listen, that there aren't drawbacks to coming together. Yeah, not everything is relevant to every community, but it's still good to know what's happening with your neighbors as well, is another one. And someone's pointing to not having everyone at the table yet. That's coming up as one of the questions. So we'll get your ideas as well for who else should be here in future conversations. All right. So again, continue. You can complete that question if you're still working on it and submit it. I'll just move on to the next one. So thinking ahead, we're hoping to continue to gather at these various scales as needed to pursue particular objectives, to get to particular actions and decisions that are needed. So in future sub-regional gatherings, what would you value working on together when we come together at this scale? So this is also just an opportunity to let us know what you like, what you don't like. How can we do this better in the future? So there's a desire here for gathering in person instead of online. Definitely hear that, especially when we're working to build those relationships and learn from one another. Coming together in person makes a difference. And again, wanting to learn from one another, what worked, what didn't. Your struggles for contractors, those like how-tos are so critical, of course. So that's a great idea too, continuing to identify priorities, cohesiveness, connecting strategies to give the river more room. Yeah, being able to be more systematic and methodical. Great. All right, so if you're still providing answers there, again, please finish those off, and I'll just go to our final question here. As I mentioned, who else would you like to see here at future sub-regional gatherings? So if you have any ideas there, please enter them in, and yeah, and we'll note those and really tend to some of that going forward in future gatherings. I see that we're coming to the end of our time, so I'll leave you with that window. It's still up. You can provide your responses there, so please do. We'd really like to know who else you'd like to see here. And I will pass it to Chief McNeil for some closing remarks here before we close the meeting. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Erica. First of all, thanking Jason for starting us off this session while I figured out my technical challenges here. You can see in the background, we're getting ready for what we call the Luxembourg meeting, where Seabird, Scowlitz, Chehalis, and Chiam get together with the village of Harrison Hot Springs and District of Kent. And many times we're talking about some of the things that we've been raised over the course of this morning. So we're advancing those discussions here at a local level. And I think it's to that end that I appreciate the discussion here at what you're calling a sub-regional level, just to bring us together in a little bit more of a relevant way, right? Sometimes I'm sitting here in my office on Seabird dealing with Metrovan and Metrovan's issues. I don't roll my eyes, but that's their reality. It's not our reality. So relevance is really critical going forward. And I hope folks and you buy into that. That we get together. Some of us have excellent relations, like our Luxembourg committee here. Others down the valley, you don't have that, and up the valley, you don't have that. So these kinds of gatherings, we have opportunity to build relations. We really encourage folks to think, give more thought to what it is that you've heard over the course of this morning. We're continuing to build each session we're having, and I'd really like to get to a point where we have a strategy that we can present to both orders of government, budgets requests that we put to both orders of government, and actually start doing things. And just signaling to you that in some of the other work that I'm doing around emergency management, climate resilience, there's just over $2 billion available through federal programs that would align with these ideas of regional critical infrastructure and locally essential services around emergency response and resilience in particular. So a lot of money is out there, but they're waiting for proposals, waiting for ideas, and I'm encouraging them to prioritize regional asks over local asks, because more people are better served, right? And my last comment for now, one of the reasons I prioritize regional critical infrastructure myself is just looking at the geography of the Lower Mainland here, and if Highway 1 stayed dry during the next big event, then everybody south of the highway stays dry, right? And eventually everything south of the CN stays dry. So there's a rhyme and reason to it, because the more that attention we pay to the regional critical infrastructure, the more people are left high and dry post-event, and they're more available to support those that may not be as fortunate as being high and dry until we build out this entire strategy. But looking at thanking our whole LFFC team, I appreciate you allowing me to be the voice of the group. We've got an excellent group together, a tremendous capacity, and we know we got a lot of skill and competency, experience at the community level too. And I really hope this is an opportunity for you to feel engaged as we build out this whole strategy together. And that's what I really celebrate here, is we're building this with you, right? You're helping us build it. So it's not like we're doing all the work and getting a yay or a nay from you. We need your experience, your capacity to help build a really comprehensive strategy to benefit us all. So I'll leave it there for now, and I'm sure we'll follow up with some information in terms of a report, and looking forward to future meetings with you all. Take care.